Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Friends of the Semel Institute's Open Mind program on the criminal justice system and mental health, or as some family members of my family members call it, the Friends Law and Order event. We are so honored to welcome author Alisa Roth here this evening. She is the author of the critically acclaimed book, Insane: America's Criminal Treatment of Mental Illness. Alisa has come here from the Twin Cities, which means that to her this is a summer day when we're all freezing. But she's come here to be with us this evening and talk to us about her book, which is an in-depth investigation into the mental health crisis in the U.S. and the U.S. criminal justice system in our courts, our jails, and our prisons. Alisa is also a renowned journalist, a former Fulbright scholar whose work has been broadcast on NPR on shows such as Marketplace and The World. Her stories have also appeared in the New York Times and the New York Review of Books, among other publications. Following her presentation, she will be joined in conversation by an esteemed group of mental health law experts. The moderator for our discussion will be Dr. Saul Fierstein. He is a professor of psychiatry and biobehavioral sciences here at the David Geffen School of Medicine, and I believe he's been that for 30 years. And we are very grateful to Dr. Fierstein for moderating our program this evening. And he will be joined by Dr. Ellen Sachs, who is a professor of mental health law at the school across the way, USC. Ellen is also an esteemed author of the book, The Center Cannot Hold, and she's also a MacArthur Genius Award winner. Also the Honorable Carla Crawlin. She is the judge of the Superior Court of Los Angeles County here. And Dr. Kristen Ochoa, who is the medical director for the Office of Diversion and Reentry in the Los Angeles County Department of Mental Health Services. I'd like to thank all of our participants this evening for, first of all, coming here to share their knowledge and expertise with us, and we are so grateful to you for spending the evening with us to educate us about the criminal justice system and mental health. After the discussion, we will have a short time for question and answer. If you could please write down your questions on the index cards, which you hopefully picked up on your way in this evening. If not, we will pass them out again after Alisa's presentation. We will not take any questions directly from the floor, so we really appreciate your cooperation with this. Just lastly, for those of you here for the first time, and for those of you who are regulars, I apologize that this is a repeat, but tonight's program is part of our Open Mind Community Lecture and Film Series, where we bring together renowned authors such as Alisa Roth and mental health professionals and other experts for programs about mental health issues. And we offer these free to the public, but we hope that you find our programming much like an NPR station or public television, that you find our programming worthwhile, and we really appreciate and need your support to keep on bringing speakers like Alisa here to UCLA. You can join us on our website, friendsofthesemelinstitute.org. Pick up an envelope on your way out this evening. Also on our website, you will find a calendar of our upcoming events. On March 19th, we will be welcoming the author Sarah McBride. And on April 11th, we will be our Wonder of Women fundraising event. So we hope that you will join us for future events, and we thank you for being here this evening, especially on a rainy, freezing night. And without further ado, please give a warm, warm Los Angeles UCLA welcome to Alisa Roth. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Vicki, for the kind introduction. Thank you to the Friends of the Semel Institute for inviting me here tonight, and to my fellow panelists for joining me. And a special thank you to Wendy for making everything work. Fully apart from being in this summer weather, this is an especially exciting time to be in Los Angeles talking about mental illness and the criminal justice system. As many of you know, just last week, the LA County Board of Supervisors voted to tear down Men's Central Jail and instead build a new mental health facility. It's the most recent and in many ways the most promising news in a long-running debate about what should be done with the facility. Anybody who's seen it would agree that what we've known for a long time, that the jail really needed to go. It might be overly generous to call this building decrepit. But nobody's been quite sure what should replace it. Should we have a new jail? Should it be a jail especially for people with mental illness? Should it be something else altogether? And what's key about this new plan is that the new facility would be operated by the city health department, not the sheriff's department. And the care for the people in it will come from the mental health department, not sheriff's deputies. So as one of the county supervisors, Janice Hahn, told the LA Times last week, sheriff's deputies will never receive enough training to become mental health professionals, nor should they. Now, this was a close vote. It was a controversial decision. But what Hahn said goes way beyond Los Angeles and way beyond the sheriff's deputies. The reality is that people with mental illness don't belong in the criminal justice system, and yet they're there. By some estimates, as many as 50% of the people in our jails and prisons have a mental illness. Now, I'm looking forward to seeing what happens with this new facility and how it plays out. But for right now, the LA County Jail is one of the 3 largest providers of mental health care in the United States. So this is, as some of you will know, the Twin Towers building. It's in downtown LA, just across town from here and across the street from that Men's Central Jail building that we've been talking about. And the other 2 largest providers of mental health care in this country are also not clinics or hospitals, but jails. So this is Rikers Island in New York. If you've ever flown in or out of LaGuardia Airport, you may have gotten a glimpse of it out your window. And this is the Cook County Jail in Chicago. I visited all 3 of them. I know it's a dubious honor. But I've also been in smaller jails all across the country. So Tulsa, Oklahoma, for example, Rochester, New York, Hampton Roads, Virginia. And the story is effectively the same in all of them, that the local jail is the largest provider of mental health care. Here's a cartoon I like that illustrates the problem. You can see on the label that the prescription is confinement. But that the jails have become the de facto mental health care providers is just one piece of the crisis that we have in our criminal justice system. So I'm going to give you a couple of facts just to put this into context. Not only do roughly half the people in the criminal justice system have a mental illness, but 1 in 2 people with a serious people with serious mental illness have a 1 in 2 chance of getting arrested in the course of their lifetime. 1 in 4 fatal police shootings over the last several years has involved a person with mental illness. People with mental illness are less likely to make bail. When they do manage to make bail, it takes them longer than other people to get out of jail. They're less likely to make parole. And this crisis really pervades the entire system. The thing is, though, when we talk about a crisis, it usually implies something that's new and relatively sudden. So the financial crisis, say, or a political crisis. But this crisis isn't new so much as that it's been continuing and recurring over the course of our entire history. And there are a couple of key moments where we can see the crisis really come to a head. And it's happened about every century. So the 1750s, the 1850s, and the 1950s. So what I'm going to do tonight is to take us through some of that history so you can see where we've gone wrong along the way, and then hopefully keep us from repeating the past. This, of course, is Benjamin Franklin. And he first saw the crisis when he was living in Philadelphia in the 1750s, so before we were even a country. And what he and other people started to realize was that as the population of Philadelphia and the Pennsylvania colony was growing, the population of people with mental illness was also getting bigger. And that if they didn't have family to take care of them, there really wasn't any place for them to go live. And in fact, he said that without a hospital, the only place for people with mental illness to go was the house of correction. In other words, jail. And what he said was that house was by no means fitted for such purposes. So more than 250 years ago, we already knew that jail was not the place for people with mental illness to be. And yet last week, an LA County supervisor told us effectively the same thing, because that's effectively what we're still doing. So Franklin asked for money to build what would become the first hospital in America. Here's a picture of it. It opened in 1752. This picture is actually from a couple of years after that. It's not the first building. As I said, it was the first hospital in America. But more to the point for our conversation tonight, it had the first special ward for people with mental illness. So conceptually, this was very exciting, but it wasn't actually a great place once it was built. The patients were kept in cold, smelly cells in the basement. Franklin later described those cells as damp and unwholesome. People were often kept in restraints. And the public actually considered them a curiosity. And they came to ogle these patients so often that the hospital finally had to put up signs saying that if you were going to look, you had to pay something to offset the cost of having you there. Now, Pennsylvania wasn't the only colony that realized that it needed a place for people with mental illness who were part of this growing population. This is Francis Fauquier. He was governor of the Virginia colony. And a few years after the hospital in Philadelphia opened, Fauquier started looking at building one in Virginia. He took a slightly different approach. This was going to be the first hospital in America that was dedicated just to taking care of people with mental illness. So, in other words, the first psychiatric hospital. Fauquier went to the General Assembly in Virginia to ask for money to build it. I am, as it were, compelled to the daily commission of an illegal act, he said, by confining without my authority a poor lunatic who, if set at liberty, would be mischievous to society. So in other words, he was saying he was having to put people with mental illness in jail. It was partly because there was no place else for them to live, but it was also partly because society felt that people with mental illness were somehow a danger to the general order. And this is an idea that still underlies a lot of what we do today. So the hospital did eventually get funded and built. This is a picture of it, and you can actually still visit it in colonial Williamsburg. And I want to point out a couple of things that we can still see vestiges of today. The first person who was hired to run this hospital in Virginia was a man who had previously spent 5 years running the Williamsburg jail. So he's the earliest example that I found of this overlap between the penal institution and mental health care. And it's something we still see very much in evidence today. In 2014, a clinical psychologist took over running the Cook County Jail in Chicago. And just this year, the person who became the head of the prison system in Minnesota is somebody who holds an undergraduate degree in social work. And those are just two examples. Now, another thing that we saw from the old days that continues today, in colonial Virginia, it was sheriffs who were responsible for bringing the patients to the hospital. They were paid 5 pounds of tobacco for every mile they had to travel. And if the patient was so unruly that the sheriff needed extra help from another officer, they actually got paid more. And all of this foreshadows law enforcement's role as the first responders to a mental health crisis. Almost anywhere you are in America today, if you call 911 because somebody is psychotic or suicidal, it's going to be a police officer, not a clinician, not even an ambulance who responds. And I've been told that one reason that this happens is that we've always done it this way. I've also been told that there's a concern about safety. So I said earlier that there's this real sense that a person with mental illness could be, or in a mental health crisis, could be dangerous. And there's this real sense that you need a police officer to respond to that. Those are the people who are best equipped to handle it. Ironically, I would add, this is where a number of the police-involved shootings of people with mental illness have occurred. Now, the hospital in Virginia was shut down after the Revolutionary War, in part because of financial troubles. And I think it's worth remembering that money has played a role in mental health care since the very beginning, something that we still see today. We also see that there's always been a kind of cycling from community, jail, hospital. When this hospital closed, the patients who were still in it were just released into the community. And we know that at least one of them ended up back in jail. But meanwhile, we had these two hospitals, and they represented this, for the time, radical idea of where people with mental illness should go. But for the most part, people stayed in the community, and that's something that's still true today. The people who lived in the community who couldn't survive, who weren't doing well, ended up going to jail. And even in those days, the jails didn't want to take them. And it was so much so that in some states, they ended up passing laws that said that jails couldn't turn those people away. And that, again, is something I hear all the time from sheriffs and wardens. We can't say no. We can't turn people away. So by the mid-1800s, the situation had reached another crisis point. And one of the people who discovered it was this woman, Dorothea Dix. She was a teacher in Massachusetts, and one day in the 1840s, she was asked to go to a jail to teach a religious class. And when she got there, she was absolutely horrified by what she found. So what she found was that there were people with mental illness who were being held alongside people charged with crimes. And not only that, they were being either terribly neglected or treated with utter brutality. She said the people with mental illness were being kept in cages, closets, cellars, stalls, pens, chained, naked, beaten with rods, and lashed into obedience. Again, here's a moment where the history just continues to repeat itself. I regularly hear reports of jails and prisons where people with mental illness are being starved, denied their medication, held in solitary confinement, and other terrible conditions, all in the 21st century. Dix was so upset by what she saw that she started visiting jails around the country. And what she found was pretty much the same awful conditions wherever she went. But she was upset not just by what she was seeing, but by the fact that these institutions were fundamentally unsuited to dealing with the people who were being kept there. Jails and houses of correction, she wrote, cannot be so managed as to render them suitable places of confinement for people with mental illness, and who, never having violated the law, should not be ranked with felons or confined within the same walls as them. And she came to the same conclusion as the LA County Commissioner did last week, just 175 years earlier, that people who work in jails are not the right ones to be taking care of people with mental illness. Jails and overseers of houses of correction, she said, do not usually possess those peculiar qualifications required in those to whom should be entrusted the care of lunatics. Now, as many of you will know, Dix started traveling around to state legislatures all around the country, demanding that they get people out of jail and instead into a hospital. And she managed to get a real system of public hospitals put into place. Now, again, this solution wasn't perfect, but in a lot of cases, they at least tried to be asylums in the most true sense of the word. So here's a picture of one. And many of them, as you can see in this picture, many of them were like small towns. So patients could work on the farms or in the laundries or in the kitchens. One writer did remark dryly that it was interesting how having patients work in occupational therapy jobs meant that the hospitals didn't need to hire as much outside labor. But these also had chapels, libraries, even cemeteries. They were supposed to be a kind of a utopian ideal where people would be taken care of, they'd have a community, and as such, they kept growing. So that by the middle of the 20th century, about 500,000 people were living in these kinds of institutions. But pretty soon, they were really bursting at the seams. So it's not surprising that as they got bigger, they got further and further away from that original ideal. And as they grew, the therapeutic benefits decreased, largely because there just weren't enough doctors and other people taking care of all the patients. And what we ended up with back in the day were warehouses full of people with mental illness. And we've seen this more recently in our jails and prisons, albeit minus this utopian ideal. That as they get bigger and more crowded, they're less and less able to take care of the people who are there. By the 1930s and 40s, the next piece of the crisis was really starting. The conditions in the asylums had really deteriorated completely. And of course, it's ironic that Dorothea Dix and others worked so hard to get people with mental illness out of jail. And even so, they ended up in effectively the same terrible conditions, just in a different kind of institution. In 1946, a journalist, Albert Maisel, wrote an absolutely scathing article for Life magazine. In it, he concluded, the vast majority of our state mental institutions are dreary, dilapidated excuses for hospitals, costly monuments to the state's betrayal of the duty they have assumed for their most helpless wards. So 100 years after Dix proposed this idealistic alternative to jails, the hospitals themselves had now become the problem. Maisel's article was accompanied by shocking photographs like this one. And people were absolutely horrified by his report and other similar ones like it that came out around the same time. So around this time, there was kind of a perfect storm that really encouraged the states to shut down the asylum system. There were the terrible reports about the conditions in the hospitals. Medicaid was created, and it included real incentives that encouraged states to move the mental health care out of these hospitals and into the community. And then there were new drugs, namely Thorazine, that made it seem like medication was going to be the new answer to dealing with mental illness. Now, we all know, looking back, that these promises didn't pan out the way that they were supposed to. But of course, we didn't know that back then. So starting back in the 1950s, the state started to close down the asylums in great numbers, releasing patients to the community. A side note here, today's crisis of mental illness in the criminal justice system is often attributed to this shutting down of the asylums. The idea being that we just took people out of the hospitals, dumped them in the streets, and then they ended up in jail and prison. It's a very neat narrative, both for historians and for journalists like myself, because among other things, you can see, if you look at a graph of the population of the asylums, you can see the population of asylums was dropping dramatically around the same time as the population of the prisons was going up rather dramatically. But there are a number of things that suggest that this was really not what drove the today's crisis per se. Among them, we know that the people who were living in the institutions of old were largely elderly, female, and white. As many of us know today, the population of the jails and prisons are mostly young, male, and not white. We also know that the people in the state hospitals were overwhelmingly diagnosed with schizophrenia. And the diagnoses that we see in our jails and prisons today are really much closer to the mix that we see in the community. So here we are, more than 250 years after Benjamin Franklin started trying to figure out how to take care of people with mental illness. And obviously, in many, many ways, things have changed. Slavery has been abolished. Women can vote. We drive cars. But even with mental illness, we understand so much more about how it works, how it can be treated, how it should be treated, how we should take care of people, where we should take care of people. And yet, as we've seen tonight, so much of it is exactly how it was before. So we still can't decide where people should get care, where they should live. And more importantly, far too many people are confined in terrible conditions where, rather than addressing their true needs, we're just locking them up. Now, when I tell these stories, people often ask me if there's anything hopeful about this story. And I think that one of the few hopeful things that I do hear is that everybody agrees that the circumstances need to change. So you can talk to doctors, lawyers, both prosecutors and defense attorneys, judges, sheriffs, activists, family members, prisoners themselves. And everybody agrees that what we're doing right now is wrong. Beyond that, there's a broad political consensus that we need criminal justice reform and that we need it now. And of course, the mental health piece is part of that. So it's encouraging to learn about all the exciting things that are happening in LA and that I think we're going to talk about shortly, whether it's efforts to improve the mental health care in the jails or new programs to keep people with mental illness out of prison. And of course, this latest plan to build a mental health care facility instead of a jail. What we need to remember, though, is that all too often in our history, the fixes that we found have ended up turning back into the problem or becoming the problem. So if we are going to finally really resolve this crisis today, it's going to require more than just coming up with new solutions. We also really need to change the very way that we as a society think about mental illness. Thank you.
Yes, I think I'm sitting next to you.
Okay.
Good evening. My name is Saul Fierstein. I am a psychiatrist and a forensic psychiatrist. And for those of you who don't know what forensic psychiatry is, it's a branch of psychiatry that deals with the legal system. And some of that involves civil cases, but a lot of it involves criminal cases dealing with the very people who end up in institutions that we are talking about tonight. And we have three excellent discussants here, and I will reintroduce them, even though Vicki initially told you who they were. And after each of the discussants give their ideas and thoughts and reactions, I'll give some of my thoughts and reactions to Alisa's wonderful book and some of the remarks made by my fellow discussants. Our first presenter, our first discussant, is Judge Carla Crawlin, who sits on the Los Angeles Superior Court. She sits in a court called the Office of Diversion and Reentry Court. That's a relatively new court. I believe it began in 2015 in Department 44 of the Superior Court downtown. And this court serves persons who are homeless and have severe mental health disorders using a holistic team approach. That's a phrase not used in the other courtrooms in the Los Angeles court downtown. Judge Crawlin was appointed by Governor Schwarzenegger in 2008, and she's been on the court now for over 10 years. And before she was a judge, she was a deputy district attorney for 18 years downtown with experience in sex crimes, child abuse, domestic violence, and high-profile homicides. So, Judge Crawlin?
Ready?
Yes.
Okay, I didn't know if you were going to introduce everyone first. So we kind of go together, so I'll talk about one piece, and then Dr. Ochoa can talk about some of the rest of it. So in 2018 or late in 2017, my boss called me in and said, I would like you to take over the new ODR court. The answer to which is, sure, when do I start? So I really didn't know anything about it. I do have a Bachelor of Science in Psychology or bachelor's degree in psychology. I had a mentally ill sibling. So I'm well versed in these issues in my personal life. And so I knew something about it. And I've always had a very different approach to the way that I prosecuted cases. And I think in the way that I judge them anyway. And I was sort of looking always for, holistically, what is the best solution for everyone? What's the best outcome for everyone? So I think it turned out to be a pretty good fit. So I'll just give you like the quick version, and then you guys can talk to everyone else and introduce your questions. So the entry point to our court is the defense attorney. The defense attorney has to identify that this person might have a severe mental illness and might meet the criteria for our court. All of my people are felons, and these are not low-level felonies. They're very serious. There's a lot of robberies, assault with a deadly weapon. Those are probably my two most common offenses. And so I don't get low-level felonies. So the defense attorney uses a link that was created by the Office of Diversion and Reentry to initiate an eligibility screening. Someone from our ODR team will go to the jail and say, yes, this person appears to be homeless and have a severe mental health disorder. And Dr. Ochoa generates a letter to the presiding judge of criminal, and he sets the case in my court for a suitability hearing. That's when the lawyers come into play. So today, for example, was intake day. We probably had about 40 people on calendar. Almost everyone was in custody, so it's very high volume. But I had Dr. Ochoa, our other psychiatrists, the licensed clinical social workers, our master of public health administrator. We had a probation representative, someone from residential treatment, and we have one of our service provider people here today. So everybody's there, and we do like a team approach. Every defendant is re-screened by the team to ensure that they are in fact eligible, that they're willing to take medication, that they want to be part of the program. Because if they say yes and I sentence them and they leave and don't do anything, they're just taking a spot from someone else. The district attorney and I look at suitability because the defense attorney thinks everyone is suitable, right? So we look at what are the facts of the case, what's the criminal history, what's the history of mental illness treatment, and we say, yes, is this person suitable? If so, the parties reach a disposition that makes it such that I can put the person on probation. They may have suspended prison, which means if they violate probation, they would go to prison. But sometimes it's just straight probation. And basically the conditions are you get picked up from someone from the program and taken to your housing. You have to stay at the housing. It's not lockdown housing. You can come and go if you need to go to the doctor, visit someone, go to the store. You have to sign out, get permission, and come back. I tell everybody I want them to stay there every night so they're safe, so I know where they are, so they don't pick up new cases, and so they don't use drugs, which is a big issue. They get a case manager. That person develops a plan. There'll be group classes, individual classes, substance abuse, whatever the person needs, and then they come and see me regularly for progress reports. So it's really very simple. And we don't have any written criteria. My boss wanted it to be very wide open, that we could, on a case-by-case basis, look at every case. So I have to be able to put the person on probation, though. So strike prior convictions are one of my big issues, because if someone has a strike prior, either a judge has to strike the strike so they can get probation, or the DA has to agree to give an offer where the person does not have to admit the prior such that I can put them on probation. So Wednesday's intake, every Wednesday. Tuesday, Thursday, our progress reports. We do about 60 people each Tuesday, Thursday. I try to finish by noon so they're not sitting there all day. And that's kind of it. We have some people who are going to college, living in their own apartments. Get a lot of people getting their high school diplomas, working full time. It's pretty amazing what a little medication can do. That's my really high achieving group. I got a middle group that's a few steps forward, a few steps back, and that I'm working with. And then I have a group that is just really not amenable to treatment or keeps leaving or won't take medication. And those are difficult populations. Some of those people we've been able to get conservatorships for because they're too sick to get treated. Otherwise, if someone just will not stay in the program, I delete their ODR terms and conditions. I send them back to the home court to be sentenced. So that's kind of the Reader's Digest version. It's the Office of Diversion and part of Department of Health Services, and Dr. Ochoa is employed by ODR. Thank you.
Well, let me just tell you who Dr. Ochoa is. I know Dr. Ochoa from her work for years, and we see each other at meetings in department business. She is the medical director, as you've heard, for the LA County Office of Diversion and Reentry. She's an associate clinical professor at the UCLA David Geffen School of Medicine in the Department of Psychiatry. She received her MD from the Keck School of Medicine, somewhere across town. Completed her residency at Harbor UCLA when she saw the light, where she served as chief resident, and she completed her forensic psychiatry fellowship at USC. In addition, she has an MPH, a Master of Public Health, from UCLA. So she's trained in lots of places and lots of disciplines, and has a lot of perspectives to share with us about that. She also serves on the LA Superior Court panel, which she may discuss, but that's the panel of psychiatrists, which is referred to for psychiatric issues and evaluations. She is a forensic psychiatrist in Department 95, which she may talk about. That's the court which evaluates people for competency to stand trial. Kristen.
Thank you. Hi, everybody. Thanks for coming. And I see some familiar faces. I wish I could call on you because those of you are on our team and doing the work right along with us. So I'll just talk a little bit about the Los Angeles County's Office of Diversion and Reentry. It's a new office, as some of you have heard. created by the Board of Supervisors here in LA. Only about 2015, they created it. We did some of our very first cases in very late 2015, but really got going in 2016. And I was the first staff member, and we now have almost about 70 staff. We're going very quickly. It seems like every time I turn around, there's a new board motion directing our office to start a new program. We have many, many programs now. Judge Crawlin is a powerhouse, and she is responsible for one of our largest programs, which we unoriginally call ODR, Office of Diversion and Reentry Housing. It's a permanent supportive housing program. So everybody who comes into her court and the case is successfully settled, they actually go into permanent supportive housing, and we take care of them for the rest of their life. So they get intensive case management services and permanent supportive housing. So if you sort of take that as a model, that is really kind of how we design all of our programs, sort of creatively using the justice system and various tools within it to bring our patients out of jail and into the community, both in housing and treatment. And it's really kind of that simple. It's not fancier than that. So we do that through programs that work just exclusively with people who are incompetent to stand trial for misdemeanors and also for felonies. And we also serve pregnant women who are in jail and bring them out into the community, into housing. And these are usually through not people who would inevitably leave the jail and are sentenced and, walking out the door. This is not discharge planning. This is instead sort of elaborate court interventions that our staff takes on with the justice partners, people who would not have come out of jail otherwise, or they would have gone to prison, honestly. So that's what we do, and we are hoping to expand. We have already quite a lot of work, but it's nothing compared to what's really needed. I think that you've heard Alisa speak about how large our jail system is in Los Angeles, and of course our book talks a lot about our large Los Angeles system, and it is very embarrassingly, I think shamefully, the largest system probably in the world of institutionalized people with serious mental disorders anywhere. I'm hoping that is going to change. But really our whole purpose as an office is to move those folks out who can be safely moved out of the jail and into community options so that they're really residing in the community. They're not residing in institutions, whether they be mental health institutions or jail institutions, but really in the community. And the places that we send folks to, they look like someone's house. In some cases, they're actually nicer than my own. They are, family sort of residences where people have, kitchens and a cook, and the interim housing settings in particular before people go to permanent. They're really in these very warm environments with others in the various communities of Los Angeles. It's not one giant building that we're sending everybody to. So I'll stop there and we'll keep going.
We'll have a chance to direct questions at all of the people up here. If you fill out your cards, and you can do that while we're speaking, and we can direct those questions to the speakers after the discussants finish. Our next speaker, next discussant, is Ellen Sachs. Professor Sachs is the Orrin B. Evans Professor of Law and Psychiatry and the Behavioral Sciences at the USC Gould School of Law. What she once called in her book an endowed couch. She is also a professor at the University of California, San Diego School of Medicine and at the USC Institute of Psychiatry and Law. Following graduation from Vanderbilt, she was a Marshall Scholar at Oxford for graduate study in philosophy, and then she graduated from Yale Law School. She's a member of Phi Beta Kappa and the American Law Institute. American Law Institute is a fascinating organization that evaluates and creates new law and is really in the forefront of legal thinking, in my mind. And Professor Sachs wrote a wonderful book. In 2007, she wrote a personal memoir of her lifelong struggle living with schizophrenia. This is a viewpoint that you often will not hear from a psychiatrist or a lawyer or anyone to speak publicly about it, but I think you'll hear some things from Professor Sachs that will be fascinating. The book is called The Center Cannot Hold, My Journey Through Madness. In 2009, she was awarded the MacArthur Genius Grant for her research, writing, and teaching about issues of mental illness and the law. And with the funds that you get from the MacArthur Grant, she founded the Sachs Institute of Mental Health Law, Policy, and Ethics at USC in 2010. She's appointed to the Center for Mental Health Services National Advisory Council by the Secretary of Health and Human Services, Kathleen Sebelius. And finally, and fascinating for me, is she's a graduate of and a faculty member at the new Center for Psychoanalysis. So you're hearing all the different perspectives that she can give for us. One footnote about Professor Sachs, and we've talked a lot about that institution across town. She is not a stranger to UCLA. In addition to frequent teaching and presenting here, she collaborated with our own professor, Kenneth Wells, professor of psychiatry, on writing a libretto for a chamber opera that he composed based on her book, The Center Cannot Hold. And that opera played to sold-out audiences here at the Semel Institute. Professor Sachs.
Thank you, Dr. Fierstein Stahl. I really appreciate this. Is this working? Now? Now? Okay. Thanks. Thanks so much for that really kind introduction. And I also want to thank Vicki Goodman and her family, including my dear friend Robin, for what they do with the Friends of the Semel Institute and this program in particular. I'm also honored and delighted to be presenting with Judge Crawlin and Dr. Ochoa and to be talking about Alisa Roth's wonderful book. So actually, Saul told me I had like 15 minutes, so I'm going to go a little bit longer than the first two people have gone, if that would be okay. So I'm honored and delighted to be a commentator on Insane, America's Criminal Treatment of Mental Illness, great title, an important account about how our mental health / criminal justice system is broken and badly in need of fixing. I'm also going to talk some about the story Alisa Roth tells about what's going on in this space, her thoughts about ways we can make things better, and my own experiences as a person with a mental health disorder, or as people now say, a person with, quote, lived experience, and what worked and didn't work in my case. Of course, I recognize that I'm an N of only one, but my experience may add to the case stories in a sense that Alisa so compellingly provides. I'd first like to say how important this topic is. The current system certainly affects all the stakeholders, whether victims, criminals, their families, or others affected by the crime. Indeed, it is part of the landscape of our culture and society. Getting this right will make all of us better off. Second, Roth upends the conventional stories of how this happened. For example, we closed the hospitals so people were trans-institutionalized into jails and prisons. She provides a complex and nuanced set of factors that were at work. Third, she makes great use of examples, case histories that illustrate what she's saying. It's much more persuasive to put a human face on these stories than to quote statistics. That said, fourth, she has also done extensive research on all of her issues. She does quote statistics, but she's also read extensively in the literature, scholarly articles, research studies, and case studies, and studies in different disciplines as well, such as law and psychiatry. Part of her extensive research is to interview multiple stakeholders, including, as mentioned, the violent people themselves, families of victims and perpetrators, doctors, other mental health professionals, hospital personnel, police, and wardens in jails and prisons. And she discusses innovative policy practices like CIT training. She also discusses failures in the system, like excessive use of force with people with mental illness and keeping people in solitary confinement for years, even though it's very toxic, and all the more so with people with mental health disorders. Roth also accesses court documents to gain more information than what she's been able to glean from the people themselves, and she makes interesting and important recommendations to address what happens in this space. For example, we should provide more care at the front end so we don't end up having to provide treatment after someone with mental illness has committed a terrible act of violence and other people have been badly hurt. Roth also endorses the use and value of mental health courts where people opt into a treatment court where they'll be, quote, sentenced, we were hearing about this, so to speak, to treatment versus punishment and often have their records expunged when they finish the program. These programs have proved very effective. So I actually run an institute at USC called the Sachs Institute for Mental Health Law Policy and Ethics. And one year we did have a program on the criminalization of mental illness. Steve Leifman, the Miami judge who spearheaded mental health courts, actually spoke. And afterwards, Jackie Lacey, the head prosecutor in LA, decided to set up such a program here too. It's noteworthy that she's the chief prosecutor. It's easy to imagine a chief public defender endorsing such an idea, and it's very cool that a prosecutor has. It's great when people in all sectors agree what is the right thing to do and step up and do the right thing. Some ideas on the horizon are the use of what's called supported decision-making, which is where instead of finding someone incompetent and appointing a guardian to make their decisions, or in the criminal justice system, delaying the process, you ask them to identify people in their lives who they trust to help them make decisions. And then what we're going to do in our studies is follow these people, who they pick and why, are they happy with the decision-making process, and what are downstream effects like less hospitalization and more community living and working. So right now we're in 4 American jurisdictions and 2 Spanish jurisdictions, and we're talking to other American sites as well. This is the first such study in the mental health context. SDM has been used with developmentally disabled people in the past, but never here. And we're studying it right now in the non-criminal context, medical decision-making, financial decision-making. But I'm now having conversations with the folks who are administrating the Mental Health Services Act, the so-called millionaire tax, about doing this in the criminal space as well. The main virtue of SDM, I think, is it restores more people to being the architects of their own lives, and an incidental benefit is allowing the system of things like adjudication and punishment to go faster and more smoothly. My own story indicates why I'm so appreciative of what Alisa Roth has done here. I've had a serious mental illness, namely schizophrenia, since 1977. So let me tell you a little bit more about myself. So I was diagnosed, as I said, with schizophrenia, and I was given a grave prognosis, expected to be unable to live independently, let alone to work. And that's not how my life turned out. And what I'd like to do is to describe what having schizophrenia is like. And I hasten to add that what schizophrenia is like for me may be very different than for other people. Everybody becomes psychotic in her or his own way. For me, I developed prominent delusions like that I've killed hundreds of thousands of people with my thoughts, or that a nuclear explosion is about to go off in my brain. I've had rare fleeting hallucinations, e.g. of a man standing in front of me with a raised knife, and my speech can get disorganized to the point of incoherence. For example, standing on the roof of the Yale Law School library, I asked my classmates, "Are you having the same experiences as I am of words jumping around the pages of the cases? We've got a case that joins. I don't believe in joints, but they do hold your body together." So that's an example of words that are connected in some way, but when put together, don't make much sense. And the technical term here is called loose associations. Another important point for people who interact with or are working with a consumer/patient, how to respond when they say something crazy. On the one side, you can say words to the effect of, "That's nuts, totally delusional, you're really losing it." Not the right thing to say. Nor should you say, "Gosh, if people are poised to break in, we should call a burglar alarm company right away and stay at a hotel until the system is installed." The kind of thing I think you should say is, "Gosh, it sounds like you're having really scary thoughts about things. I know how hard this must be. Let's work together to figure out what we should do here." I'd also like to say that for me, my American lengthy hospitalization was very toxic. So I think just putting people in hospitals instead of jails is not the right way to go. Parenthetically, when I was committed in Connecticut, my physician's emergency certificate said I was dangerous to myself and others. And it also said that I was gravely disabled. And the reason they gave was that I was unable to do my Yale Law School homework, which made me wonder about much of the rest of New Haven. So what should have been done instead? I think intensive outpatient treatment, 5 days a week, and good meds would have done the trick, but it wasn't even tried or suggested. I granted not many people can afford this, but for those who can and are willing, why not? we would be sparing people all the costs and risks of hospitalization. So the first time I was hospitalized was for a month, and the second time was a year later for 4 months, and then the third time, 3 years later, was for 5 months in the USA. The last time I was hospitalized was in 82, 83. I sometimes say not being hospitalized in all these years is perhaps my proudest accomplishment. But then I thought, if my cancer didn't come back, I wouldn't say I was proud, but that I was lucky. And that's really the same here. I fortunately have never ended up in jail or prison and have never been charged with a crime. That probably has more to do with my demographic, so to speak, than my mental illness. A woman from a close and caring middle-class family with a lot of resources, for example, to get help and no trauma in the family and no criminal history, is in a really different space than many less privileged people with many fewer resources and exposed to much more trauma. I did have an exchange with the police, though, which I did find very traumatic. I was driving to my analyst, and about a block from his office, I had an accident. I don't remember the accident, and fortunately no one was hurt. But when the police asked if I had anything to drink or use drugs, I said, truthfully, no. But then they asked if I was on any meds, and I said yes. I was put into handcuffs and driven to the station. And they said they were charging me with, quote, misdemeanor driving under the influence. Misdemeanor only because no one was hurt. I didn't know you could get a DUI for driving under the influence of psychotropic meds as prescribed. I mean, there are, of course, meds for which that is true. You don't want to drive after taking Ambien the night before to sleep, or if you're on high doses of benzos. But with the drugs I'm on, my psychopharmacologist says it's not usual practice to tell people not to drive. The drugs can be sedating, so the recommendation is to try to drive with caution and see how it feels. Anyway, the police then took me to a hospital in handcuffs to take a blood test to confirm I wasn't on alcohol or drugs. Of course, walking through the hospital in handcuffs was at best embarrassing, at worst utterly humiliating. They asked what I did, and I said I was a law professor at USC. When they asked what I taught, and I said mental health law, they laughed at me. And then we were back at the station. I wasn't put in a cell, but I was kept in a small room with an officer watching me, and I remained in handcuffs. I think I must have been stressed out because I didn't have the presence of mind to call anyone, in particular my husband, who would have called folks at the law school who could have helped out. After a few hours, they let me call someone to take me home. Eventually, they dropped the charges. This whole experience was very traumatic. In particular, being in handcuffs reminded me of the time when I was restrained for long periods of time in the psychiatric hospital. In a word, about 20 hours a day for 2 days, and then from 5 to 15 hours a day for the next 2 to 3 weeks. My chart, as I read later on, had this comment, quote, use restraints liberally. This experience with the police then was very triggering for me, as it would likely be for most people. I wondered if I was treating more shabbily than others because the police knew I had a serious mental illness from my meds. I considered contacting Jackie Lacey, who has talked at some of my events, but I decided just to put the event behind me and go forward with my life. I should also say I've been approached twice by, I think, the police and the sheriffs to talk to officers about how they might best interact with people with mental health challenges. I basically said one of the things that Alisa described so well. Psychotic people are scary because they're scared themselves. Their scariness is a defense for them against their own fear. And this means acting in such a way as to take the volume down, so to speak, rather than using a show of force, why that's so important. I might also say the police and sheriffs pretty much always send a delegation to our mental health programs put on by the Sachs Institute, so they might learn more about how best to act in the space, and I give them credit for doing this. And of course, there are cases where the officers make bad decisions, and even more rarely is a rogue cop who intentionally hurt someone with mental illness. Indeed, a much higher percentage of people with mental health disorders, as we've heard today, are involved in problematic cases of use of force, and this is something that should be followed and addressed. But bottom line, we are all in this together, and we must keep working together as long and as hard as we need to address the issues in this space. Alisa Roth has done such a wonderful service by putting out there this detailed, thoughtful, well-researched, on-the-ground, compelling and engaging, etc., account of our broken system of mental health and criminal law. Thank you, Alisa, for what you do, and thank all of you in the audience for caring about these issues. Even though I'm at a UCLA event, I'd like to invoke the slogan of my campus at USC, namely, fight on. Together, we can try to make things better for families, for patients, and for all of us in the community. Thank you again.
Have your microphone. Thank you, Professor Sachs. Professor Sachs gave us a view of the mental health system from her perspective that most of us will never have. Not just a view of treatment resources, inpatient and outpatient, that she contended with, but an eyeball vision of the personal interaction of a person in the most vulnerable, confused, frightened, and disorganized state with a chaotic world around her. It's a view of a patient, a person, dependent on doctors and institutions, grasping for hope, for clarity, for comfort, and for sanity. She told us what that looks like in her book, which I highly recommend, The Center Cannot Hold. And she told us a little about that tonight. And your remarks about being arrested for being under the influence struck me about something in Alisa's book, and that's about policing, about the narrow view and the ignorance about mental health that police have. And if you have a hammer, everything looks like a nail. So no matter who's driving the car, they follow protocol, they arrest you, they take you in, and only later do they figure out the mistakes.
Actually, if I can interject, some of the stories I've heard on the road are police coming to a scene where someone's troubled and the person is gravely suicidal, and the police shoot the person. You know, I guess that's suicide by cop, but you know.
That's another program. Alisa Roth's book gives us another view, which is the obverse view from the world we know as doctors, healthcare personnel, police officers, correctional guards, government planners, all of us facing tormented, frustrated, and helpless people with mental illness who are struggling to survive and recover and take control of their lives. So you have one view from the patient and one view from the treaters, and there are two worlds. We think we understand our own institutions because we spend every day there. We would like to think that we are doing the very best we can with the resources we have. But have we lost our objectivity, our neutrality, being so invested in our jobs and the institutions that employ us and define us? Ms. Roth challenges all of us to see our jobs and ourselves more clearly. People who work in the criminal justice system don't think of themselves as punitive and authority-based. By asking whether we can ever treat mental illness in correctional institutions, we are forced to see the world in that obverse view of the treated and mistreated prisoners in that system. Ms. Roth describes the institutional rigidity which is so resistant to change. She helps us see the world that her characters, and it turns out they're pseudonyms, so giving you their names would be meaningless, but each of them is a fascinating study of someone's trip through the criminal justice system and the experience they encounter. We feel the frustration they felt getting the understanding, the comfort, and the treatment they needed. But Ms. Roth doesn't stop there, and this is why her book is so eye-opening, and I think perhaps will be a tool to create new visions and results. After exposing all the weaknesses and problems of the system, she proposes solutions. Think of that. She tells us how we can reinvent our systems to make them more sensitive, more compassionate, and more effective in treating mental illness. With this new clarity and with a redirection of our priorities and sensibilities, we can set the agenda for where we are going. And here I have to thank Vicki for arranging with the Board of Supervisors to have their vote right before this program, so we'd have something really to discuss here. 1 week ago, our County Board of Supervisors voted on a plan to tear down the Men's Central Jail downtown. There was little dissension with that part of the decision. The difficult part came with deciding what to replace it with. There had been a plan since 2015 to replace it with what was called a Consolidated Correctional Treatment Facility, which would have cost $2.2 billion and which would have held 3,885 inmate patients, they were to be called, in a rehabilitation-focused center. Well, that might have sounded initially like a good thing. It's rehabilitation-focused, and we heard that it's going to be run by the Department of Mental Health and staffed by the Department of Mental Health. But the supervisors actually voted against it, 3-2. And Supervisor Hilda Solis said, it's still a jail. It's still walls. It's still preventing people from having freedom, the possibility of even rehabilitation. One of the supervisors who voted to build it, and you saw this, I think, in Alisa's first slide. She said, sheriff's deputies will never receive enough training to become mental health professionals, nor should they. Jailers armed with tasers and pepper spray are inherently detrimental to creating the safe environment necessary for mental health care. So what should we build? If we're not going to build that institution, what do we replace this jail with? And I found that Alisa's book tells us very clearly and persuasively what we need to do. She traveled around the country and she found systems that work. She examined what was called a Crisis Intervention Team, a CIT. It's a concept which gives the police special training on how to handle people with mental illness. Sounds revolutionary, but you don't find that very much in this country. She recognizes this program in which police spend more time learning how to relate to people than how to shoot. Training police to respond in a more sympathetic, healthcare-oriented way with what she calls slow policing will result in fewer arrests of mentally ill people. And if there are fewer arrests, then people don't get caught in the system where all of this abuse and neglect occurs. Ms. Roth sees the need to replace jails for the mentally ill with what she called social services ecosystems, a fascinating term. She found that approaches that fail on the streets with aggressive policing also fail in prison hospitals with what she called a warrior mentality. That's the mentality that the guards, the correctional officers have at times. She tells us that we must replace the warrior mentality with a guardian mentality. Inside the institution, the staff needs to think like mental health workers, not like cops. And it's not just theory. It's now a reality in places like San Antonio and in Miami, Florida. In San Antonio, there's a place called the Restoration Center, which is a social systems ecosystem with a mental health crisis center, a sobering center, a detox and rehab program, a methadone clinic, and a homeless shelter. It doesn't sound like any jail or prison I have visited. In Miami-Dade, a visionary judge found a way to divert people from the criminal justice system to treatment facilities with the Criminal Mental Health Project. In this jail diversion program, when a person with mental illness is arrested on a misdemeanor or some non-felony charges, he has the choice to be placed in this program. The description of these programs in Alisa's book are fascinating. You sort of wonder, how did all these good things possibly to come together? And then they did, because there were people in San Antonio or Miami-Dade who made it happen. Ms. Roth advances the use of problem-solving courts, like mental health courts, drug courts, domestic violence courts, to resolve the crises and conflicts that now might lead to incarceration. She identifies what she calls points of inflection, where the critical decisions are made to lead to better outcomes. When we talk about all these new courts and problem-solving courts, we've heard tonight from a new development right here in Los Angeles, from Kristen, Carla. They describe the pioneering efforts we are making to make this vision come true. They are the vital points of inflection that Ms. Roth described. The Office of Diversion and Reentry was created to divert mentally ill arrestees from jail altogether. We need to continue the work we began in 2015. The Los Angeles Times had a very powerful editorial on this, and they wrote, "Say no to the mental health jail and instead create a roadmap for real mental health care of a scope and at a scale that meet the county's needs." Ms. Roth, in her book, has given us a blueprint. She describes the tools that are proven successful in communities around the country. And I say just, let's do it here, and let's do it now. Now, thank you for all these questions, and let's see if we can try to address them. Question for Judge Crawlin. Where do you get the services from? Are they enough? And is it cost effective?
It is cost effective. I get the services from Dr. Ochoa. We have 7 service providers. So each person gets assigned one, and they have a case manager at that program. And then depending on that program, sometimes things like the mental health piece are outsourced. Sometimes it's there, depending on the provider. What else do you think about that? Housing. Everybody's getting steered towards housing. So the key is to get people off the streets and into housing. So my less well-functioning people go to like board and care. Middle group or entree would be like group communal living, recuperative care. And then on the final end, people end up in their own actual apartments. It's really exciting. Like I had someone yesterday tell me all about their new place. They're just ecstatic. 2 walk-in closets. I'm like, I don't even have one. 2. So it's very exciting to see people getting into their own units and just really, really thriving.
I have a couple of questions here about homelessness, and I think in Los Angeles this is a very large issue that seems to intersect with all of the other issues we're talking about here. One question, that mental illness in the homeless population needs to be addressed. Yet the only discussions we have about homelessness is sheltering them, building shelters for them. How can we get across that shelters are not the answer is one question. And another questioner asks about the challenges presented by the interplay of mental illness, homelessness, undocumented immigrants, and drug addiction. I don't know who.
Wow. I can do the first one. She can do the first one.
I agree. Shelters, the literature has not shown that shelters are effective. Longer-term housing solutions and permanent supportive housing is far more effective, and that's sort of what we specialize in. We're fortunate to be part of the Department of Health Services, runs all the county hospitals, as well as runs the county's largest housing program called Housing for Health, which they're our partners, and we do all this work together. And we really believe that folks should have a place, not a shelter, but a place where they can be long-term and really forever. And to support them in that and to help them pay for that permanent supportive housing option, as well as we believe that you can't just send someone to their own housing without services. So forever, they will also have intensive case management services so they can stay in that housing. That's really a forever thing. And if we do that, it is still, from even an economic perspective, far more cost effective than putting someone in jail at, $100,000 plus per year, or even a state hospital, which is something like $250,000 plus per year. And we do this work for something like $25,000 to $30,000 a year. So
we actually on campus have a homelessness problem. So you have students sleeping in the stacks of the library. A wealthy, rich place like USC, how did that happen, and what can we do?
They can afford tuition, but they can't.
Or they get loans to go to school, but not enough money to actually. And there's a pantry so they can get food because some people can't afford to buy food. I mean, it's just scandalous. Well, they've actually just appointed a homeless coordinator, and she's gathering a group of people together to talk about what we can do.
Well, I think that's one of the issues is, like, I see people out in the streets and I'm like, oh, poor person. And I'm thinking, commit a felony and you could come and see me. But you shouldn't have to, right? So we're doing our part because the entry into my system is that you have committed a felony. But once we've managed this, we need to go the step before it, which is, can't you get services through another path without first committing a felony? And one of the questions I had is, how long is that? Your probation with me is usually 3 years, or it could be 5 years on some really serious cases, but usually 3 years. At the end, we try to reduce it to a misdemeanor if it's an offense that's called a wobbler, and expunge it. If it's just a straight felony, expunge it. I just had my first person last week. I was setting a 3-month progress report. I was like, you're doing great. I'll see you in 3 months. He said, my probation's going to expire. And I said, how could that be? Because I took over the court in 2018, but my boss had it in 2016. So I looked, and he was interviewing today at the U.S. Postal Service, and this was last week. And he happened to be a veteran, and somehow I knew that, and I marked his file. And we have a new veterans expungement section. So everybody agreed. We reduced it to a misdemeanor. We expunged it. We got him certified copies so he could go to his interview today. And I told him to write me a letter. He goes, no, I'm going to come see you. So I'm hoping he got the job. I told him, if not, don't be disheartened. There will be a job for you. But he'll be coming to see me, I hope, and hopefully he got his job. So it's 3 years or 5 years for court. But then the cases continue with the services forever, just not having to come see me or be responsible to probation.
Comment on that? In Alisa's book, she talks about points of inflection, about people who make a difference. And you were referring at one point to judges being important points of inflection. What you've just described is exactly what the book talks about as an ideal. That you made a difference for one person. If you can make a difference for one person, you can make a difference for all of society. Being able to break the habits, bad habits that we've had about sending people along in the traditional way and locking them up and waiting for things to happen. You step in and you do something for one person and you've saved humanity. Have anything there then?
One of the questions here is, how do we effectively treat and support individuals impacted by mental health disorders who are detained or incarcerated within these settings and systems, so the jails and prisons? And I think part of the answer is having, once you're in the jail or the prison, a person who's incarcerated is part of the only group in this country who has a constitutional right to health care. And I think that we really need to make sure that we have providers in the jails and prisons who understand what they're dealing with and who are really providing the best care possible. I think that training the officers who are responsible for the incarcerated people is also critical. So much the way that we're talking about training police officers, we also have to train the corrections officers. But again, we keep coming back to this. I think that the ideal scenario is to preempt this by having people not go into that system to begin with.
That one of the questions is it the case that people with severe mental illness commit violent crimes? I don't think because you have a mental illness, you're more likely to commit violent crimes. It's just that the people I see have all committed a felony, and it's usually a serious felony. So my experience is with the felon population, but I think that's skewed and just a percentage of the persons who have mental illness. And usually my people have never had mental health treatment, had very little or had sporadic, but are definitely off medication at the time of the crime.
I have more questions for you and me. So many of these questions are about how we fund the Office of Diversion and Reentry. So it's county general funds. Primarily, there's some also funds that shifted from probation to the Office of Diversion and Reentry that have been really valuable. And additionally, the Department of State Hospitals is actually decided that LA was a place they were going to try out a new intervention where people who were incompetent to stand trial on felonies did not go to state hospital, or in many cases actually where they end up is jail in San Bernardino County, which is called the Jail-Based Competency, it's JBCT, Jail-Based Competency Treatment Program. So it's just one jail to another jail. So instead of all that, they have funded us to put folks into the community, so who are actively incompetent, and restore them to competency in the community, and then hopefully move them on to stay in the community and integrate in the community through housing and treatment. So variety of sources, but still not close to being enough in terms of what we need. So again, 5,200 people in jail mental health housing, largest institution where people with mental disorders are in any one place. That is really a lot. 5,200 people. That is just the mental health population of our jail system in Los Angeles County is the size, actually larger than the size of most other jurisdictions. So that amount of people is a very, and it rotates, right? Because people are constantly coming into jail and leaving. So it's just a huge task. Since we've started our young office, about 2016, right, we have diverted about 3,000 people out of the jail and into housing and treatment. But it's still not enough. Not enough.
And the new program she's referring to is a new law passed for 2019 for mental health diversion. And you may have heard about it. I don't know if it's just us in the criminal field who've heard about it or not. So the legislature was well intended. And if a person was found to meet 6 criteria, have a severe mental health disorder, that the crime was committed because of that, if they're amenable to treatment, they could be diverted, which means you don't have to plead and get convicted. It can be a maximum of 2 years. The judge can send you to treatment and different things. And at the end, if you successfully complete it, your case is dismissed. It's expunged and can only be used for very, very limited purposes, like the record is sealed. However, there were no programs developed. So you have a really well-intentioned law, but no program. So Dr. Ochoa has the pilot project that's funded. We're going to do a subset of that population. They have to have one of 3 mental health disorders and be homeless. So we're going to have a smaller group than the broader, but then they can go to our ODR population, and we'll be starting that soon. And those people will come in without a conviction, without probation, and then have the chance to earn a complete dismissal.
Those are real incentives for people to accept treatment. I mean, one of the questions was, what do you do with people who don't want treatment? People who want to take drugs and they just go back out and reoffend. If the consequences of not accepting treatment turn out to be more uncomfortable for people, there might be some sway towards accepting treatment voluntarily and finding that it's not only better for them, it's going to be more economic. They have jobs, their lives are better. In the end, people will accept treatment, seek treatment.
We have kind of it's a really neat thing to see Judge Crawlin's courtroom. It's sort of like something like a courtroom /ER/clinic. And we have our staff are in there, so there's a whole gaggle of clinical staff, and we literally are putting on the record as we work directly with the patients who are clients of a defense attorney there, with the DA there, Judge Crawlin there, and everyone's sort of saying, and our staff, hey, look, you could have this. This is going to happen right now. We're going to settle this thing, and you're going to, get some treatment, and we'll put on the record that treatment. Sometimes we put long-acting antipsychotic injections on the record because folks aren't used to taking pills every day. That's not something they've been able to do, and that has resulted in them coming, repeatedly into the justice system. So we do all that, kind of all in the moment. And so, yes, I can see in other realms how you would call some of these, the folks that we're working with, treatment resistant, but it really sort of changes in this environment. It doesn't, I almost object to I object. I almost object to that kind of language, right? Because it I don't know, it's pejorative.
Okay, here's what we kind of do. Like, if people don't really want treatment or they're like not on medication, we try to persuade them to like try one injection, wait a month in jail, see how it's going, And in that month, the person is really much better.
It's a respectful
and really
negotiation.
more amenable.
Yeah.
I try not to let people reject it on that first day because I know it's not a wise choice. Sometimes I'm not successful, but I'm like, just try it, just see how it goes. Have an open mind. Come back and see me. And we're sort of able to get people medicated so that they're more clear-headed and can make a good choice.
Also, I think, sometimes people say people with serious mental illness don't have insight that they're ill. But even if that's true, I think you can say to someone, look, I know you don't think you're ill, but you've been complaining about kind of sleeplessness and feeling want to give it a try. So there are ways to try to recruit people to want treatment so we don't have to use force, basically.
I would add that we also need to change how we think about, as we've been talking about, how we think about mental illness. And so I think in jurisdictions that are less sympathetic than LA, you often see this response, so, well, you committed the crime, so you're going to do the time, and it doesn't matter what drove you to that behavior. And the way the criminal justice system has been built and has developed is that you commit that first crime, and then the second time something happens, it's worse, and it cycles into a worse situation. I think that in other scenarios, we've come around to the fact that failing is part of the process. So somebody who's trying to quit smoking might try 10 times, and we're not saying, tisk, tisk, you messed up. It's, oh, you can do it next time, it's okay. Or somebody who's trying to quit using alcohol or misusing alcohol. And I think that we need to have a better understanding that it's not necessarily from point A to point B that people are responding to these problems, but rather that we need to be more sympathetic to that need.
Any other questions?
I would like to thank all of our discussants, Alisa Roth, Dr. Fierstein, Dr. Sachs, Dr. Ochoa, the Honorable Judge Crawlin. Thank you all for being here this evening, sharing your knowledge and expertise. I have one last question for Alisa. Why this topic? What motivated you to do this research on this topic?
I was looking at the criminal justice system, and I realized that we're talking about race in the criminal justice system, and we're starting to talk about the poverty piece in the criminal justice system. And this mental health piece is the third part that everybody likes to ignore or push aside. And so, and I also realized that many people were seeing it in one little narrow sector that was there. So the police officers will tell you that this is the issue that they have to respond to, or the judges will tell you this is what we're seeing in our courtrooms every day. But there was very little sense that this really goes throughout the system. And I really wanted to understand better how we've gotten to this point, and hopefully how we can make it better.
Thank you so much. With these 5 people working on this problem, I think it's very hopeful that things will change. So thank you all. You have a chance to buy a copy of Insane out in the foyer and have it signed. And I thank you all for being here this evening and hope to see you all again soon. Thank you.